Previously on the Wishology Trilogy Review.
Well, it's great to know that everything is fine in the universe.
Last week, I took a look at part 1 of Wishology, a trilogy of 3 Fairly Oddparents specials that was actually somewhat good. Today, I'll be looking at the second of these 3 episodes, the exciting middle part. Let's jump right in, starting with the...
Hey, it's your local reviewing panda here to help you out with reviewing Wishology. It's a trilogy, so I thought that I can help you out on this big task. Although your first video on the Wishology trilogy was good, I think with your skill and my skill, we can make part 2 and part 3 even better. So I was thinking we can do part 2 on your side, and then we could do part 3 on my side. What do you think?
Well, I could use the extra help getting these videos out, and I know how much you love the Fairly Oddparents, so why not? So, without further ado, this is my review of the exciting middle part with Alpha J. And yeah, this is a collab series now.
Wishology Part 1, or The Big Beginning, had a great start that still holds up today. Wishology Part 2, or like Nintendo said, the exciting middle part, not only still holds up well, but also impresses me on how timeless and entertaining the episode is on so many levels. From character interaction, to funny jokes, to Poof's small arc, Part 2 doesn't disappoint. I like how the second part revolves around the inner and outer shell of characters, mostly Timmy. While the beginning of the episode focuses on Timmy being very arrogant, while cleverly not wanting any more conflict at the end, he seems to be the bravest of them all. There's also smaller changes in the dynamic of certain characters like Turbo Thunder, who went from being a loser to an integral part of the story. The references to Star Wars, while over my head, doesn't alienate me from the episode. I enjoy this because I believe references or parodies should be developed enough for an audience to notice and enjoy, but not so attached that without knowing the topic, you don't understand the jokes or plot development.
While it is timeless, I didn't find the exciting middle part to be very entertaining. I didn't really enjoy many of the jokes, which is bad since I thought that the episode put more emphasis on the comedy than the actual story. Many of the major plot points in part 2 are just gags, and it makes it hard for me to take much of the episode seriously. The entire reason the darkness has returned is because there's a continuation to the prophecy that the characters just happen to not see in part 1. This is not only lazy writing, but also a lame way to continue the story. I do think that many of the concepts in the episode are cool. I liked seeing Timmy work with his enemies, and seeing them go up against nearly his entire world. Again, Wishology makes good use of previously established aspects in the Fairly Oddparents universe, like the Fakeifiers, and the inclusion of characters like Chester, AJ, Trixie, and Mark Chang. If there's one moment that basically sums up my feelings on this entire episode, it's the scene where Timmy's friends and family meet his fairy godparents. I expected this to be a huge moment, as it almost feels like something the entire series has been building to. But instead, the scene is just an excuse to make a bunch of quick jokes, when it could have been so much better. And there are so many moments like that in this episode.
While I can't agree that ever since Fairly Oddparents returned from its hiatus, Season 6 and onwards has been a downward slope in terms of quality, there are some jokes in here that I personally don't like. In fact, some of the forms of comedy here are a staple later in the series and have bled out into other series created by Hartman. For example, there was a scene in which Timmy said he wouldn't be fooled by the darkness anymore, and literally in the next scene, he gets fooled because an Eliminator disguises itself as Trixie. This type of comedy I have thoroughly pointed out later in the series, but here it's in its infant stages, and I cannot bias that based on its later degradation in the latter part of the series. It does not bother me here personally, because the plot continues quite quickly. At no point did I feel like the plot took a long time to move forward. I will agree that the comedy here isn't something to take notes on. However, I think you're putting a lot of tension on a plot that, like you said, wasn't the true emphasis. As the backbone of a story, it was solid, and I would even argue, really good. The idea of deception, betrayal, and distrust, all in the Very Oddparents special, is something that I would want to see, and it's done here quite nicely. The sequence nearing the beginning, with the audience seeing Mark Chain leaving Yugopotamia, and the quote-unquote Mark coming towards Earth, turning out to be a fake, was a great sequence. There are many more like that throughout the episode, which leaves the viewer with a reason to be on the edge of their seats. But yes, let's talk about the part where Cosmo and Wanda talk to Timmy's parents. The levels of egotism are so high, you need an oxygen tank just to reach the top. Not to mention that they all try to charge at Timmy while still being in prison, and hit the prison bars like idiots. Yes, there's stupid comedy in here, but I did not let it get in the way of enjoying what I think is a pretty great extension beyond part 1.
When I say that the exciting middle part puts more emphasis on the comedy rather than the story, I mean that for only certain parts of the episode. I agree that there are some well-written parts to it that aren't ruined by the stupid comedy. The scene that you already mentioned with the Eliminator Mark is a good example, and additionally, the Star Wars scene works because it has a purpose in the episode, and does more than just constantly reference the films. There are some other aspects in the episode that I enjoyed as well. The 2D animation was top-notch once again, and there wasn't nearly as much distracting CGI all throughout the episode, except for the disturbing and poorly animated Guardian. And I also thought that it was kinda cool how the Eliminators basically became Kirby, and gained the ability to take the powers of whatever they suck up. It was out of left field and kind of silly, but it definitely made the plot a bit more interesting. However, there are also numerous other parts of the episode that are extremely forced and make no sense. And coincidentally, all of them involve the heroes escaping from the Eliminators. Timmy and Mark escape from the Cave of Prophecy to Timmy's room through a random portal that is never explained, and Poof defeating the Eliminators through karate is pretty dumb as well. I don't buy that he was able to become the master of this skill through watching 10 seconds of a movie. Even in this show, it's not a character arc, it's just a convenient way to move the plot forward. I do agree that I'm glad that much of the episode does keep the plot moving forward, but it comes at the expense of a coherent plot, and I think that's a bit more important.
I can see how the Poof part can be very out of left field, however, to me, it just doesn't take away my enjoyment. Another part that I do want to point out is that when they do make small subtle details, they can be quite defined, whether intentional or unintentional. For example, do you know what the name of the child who had their guitar signed by Timmy in the beginning of the second part was? Sparky. Also, in the Chosen One video game, there was a fairy dog.
Coincidence? I think not.
I won't say that the story is perfect. In fact, there is parts of the movie in which I think it's lacking. For example, the darkness gets clogged, despite it being, well, the darkness. I also didn't like that Wanda had to take time out of the episode to explain the prison that in the end was already implied to be max security. Mark did also have the characteristic of pulling out things exactly when he or the plot needed him to.
And I can get us a spaceship. All I need is a high-speed internet connection, a laptop, and a whoopee cushion.
Bingo. What? I said I couldn't pull a spaceship out of my
In
pants.
fact, the way that they transitioned from regular Timmy and the Chosen One, Timmy, was brute because of the way the darkness had to be not only a hard catalyst to start the second part, but so abrupt that the plot somewhat stagnated to emphasize Timmy's reaction. Although I liked his clearly not humble attitude, it didn't excuse how the episode tried to switch his characteristics so unnaturally. The movie follows your standard 3-act structure. The beginning scenes follow through to set up the midpoint or the all is lost moment to give the characters one more shot at the end, which, if you consider the climax, follows through very uniformly. However, I do like the crew using fire to fight fire with the Eliminator belts. I think that was a very impressive way to make a round trip back to the beginning because again it sets up the concept of deception. Deception can be used in a bad way or a good way, and both happened with the antagonists and protagonists respectively. Like in another movie that Very Oddparents had a role in, the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, these movies do have a lot of tiny holes in them. Like Poof opening the prison lever only for it to open one door that the plot needed it to, or like I said, the infinite darkness clogging. But the bigger picture was a smooth ride, and that's what I appreciate about this good second part.
I sort of agree with your outlook on the episode. On the surface, many parts of it appear to work well, but I feel that all of the little problems it has, such as the obvious plot holes and plot devices, hinder the episode's overall quality for me. me. Maybe it's just that I tend to get caught up on little problems I notice in cartoons, but I feel that there were way too many in this episode to overlook. But for that, I wouldn't call this episode awful. Plus, I've constantly brought up parts of this episode that I enjoy. There's a great dark atmosphere at points, I was surprised by a few elements, and many of the characters aren't too annoying and behave like I expect them to. Except for Timmy, who, like you mentioned, suddenly switches to be very heroic at the end. It's a cool moment, but it feels very out of character and a cheap way to build up suspense for the end of the episode, even if they had to do it for the sake of Wishology being a trilogy. The ending also feels somewhat fan-servicey, with Timmy finally kissing Trixie for the first time. It just comes and goes within a few seconds, and like the moment I mentioned before with Timmy's acquaintances finding out about his secret, it feels like something that really should have been built up a little more, or even lasted a bit longer.
I can always chalk that up to them not knowing that they had 3 parts. Yes, it can be better, but it can be worse. I tend to look on the more optimistic side. Try having an episode revolve around climbing a haunted mountain, only to find out that the monster at the top really isn't bad and you wasted 11 minutes of your life. Oh wait, that's years down the line. Point being, it could be better, but it could be worse. And this was okay. The ending did do one thing in my opinion, that was essential. It made sure to not close too many doors. Since this is a 3-part series, the big climax was not in this one, so a lot of questions need to be left unanswered. One thing that I do want to criticize about the ending is pretty much a continuation of taking magical fairies, or the permission to use said magical fairies, for granted. Case in point, Trixie to Timmy, and Timmy's dad to Cosmo. In fact, it raises the question to why Cosmo can grant a wish for Timmy's dad. I'm sure you guys listening here who have watched Very Odd Parents can remember plenty of cases when Timmy needed to make a wish for himself, like in the Micecapades, the episode that pretty much wanted Timmy to speak in English, not squeak, like the mouse he was, in order to make a wish. You could just toss it as a side gag, but it sure is sad that breaking the rules become commonplace in the later seasons. Also, while everyone's getting sucked into the darkness, Timmy just walks into the frame, as if gravity, or the lack thereof, or reverse gravity doesn't exist. Unless this episode is telling me that Jorgen is lighter than Timmy, this is something we probably shouldn't be thinking about. I do like how Timmy is willing to sacrifice himself for the darkness, however, I don't think that's too bad. I do, however, think it's pretty funny that Trixie screams louder when she's not told she's pretty than when she's in outer space, clutching for dear life as someone gets sucked into a pretty much black hole.
And you can understand that if I can't have you, nobody can!
Quite the character created there.
To conclude, I still feel that part 2 of Wishology is probably the weakest of the trilogy. It kind of feels like the writers had the beginning and the end of this trilogy planned out, but then they forgot to really develop the middle and threw something together at the last minute. There aren't any huge problems here. Both the characters and plot are fairly solid, but I think that it's the little things that will make or break your enjoyment of this episode. And I think that can really be seen in both of our perspectives on this episode. On one hand, there were some cool ideas and moments, and a lot of neat little touches to both the show and part 1 of Wishology, but there are some big plot conveniences and moments that were just plain confusing as well. All things considered, the exciting middle part averages out to be an okay episode. Not something I despise, but I'll probably skip around parts of it when rewatching Wishology.
Overall, I think Wishology Part 2 can feel a little empty at parts. If you aren't already a fan of Very Odd Parents, whether back in the day or now, I wouldn't recommend Wishology if you're starting out, but as a fan, if I could use my reviewing stance to say anything, watch this trilogy. If you've already seen it, rewatch this trilogy. It's very geared towards the fans. It still holds up today, and maybe you'll understand a lot more references, probably more than me, or see things in hindsight. I'm not the biggest fan of Turbo Thunder, but Timmy and the character interactions between the main crew will keep you around. This show has a very quick pace, and while stretched over a longer period of time, I do believe that Wishology Part 2 can be better. I do think the main difference is that looking at it from a critical point of view, I do see a lot more problems than in a more casual way. Unlike Very Odd Parents episodes I've talked about before, many of these problems may be smaller based on perspective. Still problems, but not problems that will make you stop watching, like the later seasons, but as it stands, I still love it, and I'm gonna love talking about the final ending.
And I'm going to love arguing with you over the quality of this episode.
As will I, my legally obligated buddy.
Tonight, in part 3 of Wishology, he was chosen to save the universe.
Nothing is gonna stop us from defeating the darkness!
And he's saving the best
Hang on!
for last.
Operation Save Our Butts is underway!
Can you
miss the thrilling conclusion of Wishology.
Let it rip, fairies! Ha-ha! I never get tired of that.
The final ending premieres tonight at 8. All part of Wishology Weekend on Nick.